Greetings, friends. As you join us for this fall virtual conference, I must admit, we chose to host this event around Halloween this year because of the growing interest in everything from aliens and Pentagon UFOs to New Age occultism and its explosive growth over the last decade. But that said, I myself want to talk to you about something potentially far more concerning than Halloween goblins and little green men, and that is the ultimate aliens, as in the return of the Nephilim and their coming king, Apollo, Osiris, Nimrod. But first things first. As far back as the beginning of time, and within every major culture of the ancient world, the astonishingly consistent story is told of gods that descended from heaven and materialized in bodies of flesh. From Rome to Greece, before that to Egypt, Persia, Assyria, Babylonia, and Sumer, the earliest records of civilization tell of an era when powerful beings known to the Hebrews as watchers, and in the book of Genesis as the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, mingled themselves with humans, giving birth to part celestial, part terrestrial hybrids known as the Nephilim. Now, the Bible says that this happened when men began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them. When the sons of God saw the women's beauty, they took wives from among them to sire their unusual offspring. In Genesis 6:4, we read this following account, quote, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown," end quote. Now, when that scripture is compared with other ancient texts, including Enoch, Jubilees, Baruch, Genesis Apocryphon, Philo, Josephus, Jasher, and other texts, it unfolds to some that the giants of the Old Testament, such as Goliath, were the part human, part animal, part angelic offspring of a supernatural interruption into the divine order and natural evolution of the species. The apocryphal book of Enoch gives a name to the angels involved in that cosmic conspiracy, calling them watchers. And here is what we read, quote, "And I, Enoch, was blessing the Lord of majesty and the King of the ages, and lo, the watchers called me, Enoch the scribe, and said to me, Enoch, thou scribe of righteousness, go, declare to the watchers of the heaven who have left the high heaven, the holy eternal place, and have defiled themselves with women, and have done as the children of earth do, and have taken unto themselves wives. Ye have wrought great destruction on the earth, and ye shall have no peace nor forgiveness of sin. And inasmuch as they delight themselves in their children, the Nephilim, the murder of their beloved ones shall they see, and over the destruction of their children shall they lament, and shall make supplication unto eternity. But mercy and peace shall you not attain." 1 Enoch 10:3-8. Now, according to Enoch, 200 of these powerful angels departed high heaven, and they used women, among other things, to extend themselves, their progeny, into mankind's plane of existence. The interlinear Hebrew Bible offers an interesting interpretation of Genesis 6:2 in this regard. Where the King James Bible says the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, the IHM interprets that as the B'nai Elohim saw the daughters of Adam that they were fit extensions. The term fit extensions seems applicable when the whole of the ancient record is understood to mean that the watchers wanted to leave their proper sphere of existence, and in order to enter Earth's three-dimensional reality, they viewed women, or at least their genetic material, as part of the formula for accomplishing that task. Departing the proper habitation that God had assigned them was grievous to the Lord and led to divine penalization. Jude describes it this way, Quote, "The angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day," end quote, Jude 6. Besides apocryphal, pseudepigraphic, and Jewish traditions related to the legends of the Watchers and the mighty men born of that union with humans, mythologized accounts also tell the stories of gods using humans to produce heroes or demigods, half-gods. For instance, when the ancient Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament, the LXX or the Septuagint, was made, the word Nephilim, referring to the part human offspring of the Watchers, was translated Gegenes, a word implying earthborn. But that same terminology was used to describe the Greek Titans and other legendary heroes of partly celestial and partly terrestrial origin, such as Hercules, who was born of Zeus and the mortal Alcmena, Achilles, the Trojan hero son of Thetis and Peleus, and Gilgamesh, the two-thirds god and one-third human child of Lulabanga and Nisan. Now, these demigods were likewise accompanied in texts and idol representation by half-animal and half-human creatures like centaurs, the part-human, part-horse offspring of Apollo's son Centaurus, chimeras, furies, satyrs, gorgons, nymphs, minotaurs, and other genetic aberrations. Now, historian Andrew Thomas believes these mythological records are what he called thought fossils, depicting the story of vanished cultures in symbols and allegories. Or, as my friend Steve Quayle in his book Genesis 6 Giants explains, quote, "The collective memories in the form of myths, fables, and fairy tales from various cultures and ages of mankind are overwhelming evidence that the Nephilim existed," end quote. All of this indicates that the Watchers not only modified human DNA during the construction of Nephilim, but animals as well, a point that the book of Enoch supports, saying in the 7th chapter that the fallen angels sinned against animals as well as humans. Other books, such as Jubilees, add that this interspecies mingling eventually resulted in mutations among normal humans and animals whose flesh or genetic makeup was corrupted by the activity, presumably through crossbreeding. Even the Old Testament contains reference to this time of genetic mutations that developed among humans following that era, including men of unusual size, physical strength, 6 fingers, 6 toes, animal appetite for blood, and even lion-like features, according to 2 Samuel 21:20, 23 through 20. Years ago, my friend J.R. Church made an interesting point that since this activity was satanic in nature, it refers to the seed of the serpent that was at enmity with Christ. Here's what he said, quote, "The concept of a reptilian race continues throughout the Bible as a metaphoric symbol of the devil." He wrote that in the Prophecy in the News magazine, February 2009. He continues, "Later scriptures add the term dragon, with the implication that these otherworldly creatures were designed with the DNA code of a reptilian race," end quote. Now, Church went on to state how some of these satanic creatures were depicted as bat-like gargoyles or winged dragons in ancient art, and that we should not be surprised that a humanoid-type reptilian race could cohabit with human women and produce a race of giants. But all of the ancient records include the most telling extra-biblical script from the book of Jasher, a mostly forgotten text referred to in the Bible in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18. Jasher records the familiar story of the fall of the Watchers, but then he adds an exceptional detail that none of the other texts are as unequivocal about, something that I think can only be understood in modern language to mean advanced biotechnology, genetic engineering, or transgenic modification of species. After the Watchers had instructed humans in the secrets of heaven, note what Jasher says occurred. Quote, "Then the sons of men began teaching the mixture of animals of one species with the other, in order therewith to provoke the Lord." Jasher 4:18, end quote. Now, this phrase, the mixture of animals of one species with the other, does not mean hybridization, as that would not have provoked the Lord. God made like animals of different breeds capable of reproducing. For example, horses can propagate with other mammals of the Equidae classification, the taxonomic horse family as it is called, including with donkeys and zebras. It would not have provoked the Lord for that type of animal breeding to have taken place, as God himself made the animals able to do that. If, on the other hand, the Watchers were crossing species boundaries by mixing incompatible animals of one species with the other, such as a horse with a human, a centaur, then that would have been a different matter, and may cast light on the numerous ancient stories of mythical beings of variant species manufacturing that fit perfectly within the records of what the Watchers were somehow accomplishing. Now, understandably, that kind of chimera making would have provoked the Lord, and it raises the serious question of why the Watchers would have risked eternal damnation by tinkering with God's creation in that way. Yahweh had placed boundaries between the species, and he strictly ordered that each kind reproduce only after its own kind. So was the motive of the Watchers to break those rules simply the desire to rebel, to assault God's creative genius through biologically altering what he had made? Or was something of deeper significance behind the activity? Some believe that the corruption of antediluvian DNA by Watchers was an effort to cut off the birth line of the Messiah. This is a theory that posits that Satan understood the proto-evangelium, the promise in Genesis 3:15 that a Savior would be born, the seed of the woman, and that he would destroy the fallen angel's power. Satan's followers, therefore, according to this theory, intermingled with the human race in a conspiracy to stop the birth of Christ. If human DNA could be universally corrupted or demonized, they reasoned, then no Savior could be born, and mankind would be lost forever. Now, those who support that theory believe that this is why God ordered his people to maintain a pure bloodline and not to intermarry with the other nations. When Israel breached that command and the mutated DNA began rapidly spreading among men and animals, then God instructed Noah to build an ark and to prepare for a flood that would destroy every living corrupted thing. That God had to send such a universal fiat like the flood illustrates how widespread the altered DNA eventually became. In fact, the Bible says in Genesis 6:9 that only Noah, and therefore by extension his children, were found perfect in their generation. The Hebrew word for perfect in that case is tamim, which means without blemish or healthy. It's the same word used in Leviticus to describe an unblemished sacrificial lamb. Therefore, the meaning was not that Noah was morally perfect, but that his physical makeup, his DNA, had not been contaminated with Nephilim descent, as apparently the rest of the world had become. So in order to preserve mankind as he had made them, God destroyed all but Noah's family in the flood. The ancient records, including those of the Bible, appear to agree with that theology, consistently describing the cause of the flood as happening in response to, quote, all flesh having become corrupted, both man and beast. I believe the theory of DNA corruption as an intended method for halting the coming of Christ, while I believe that theory has merit, there is an alternative or additional reason that the Watchers may have blended living organisms. This is a theory that is original with me so far as I can tell, and it grew from my need to incorporate the voluminous historical texts which describes this peculiar history into a consistent account that corresponds with Scripture. So to harmonize the ancient records, I came to believe that the overriding motive for whatever the Watchers were doing with the DNA of various species had to be understood within the context of their foremost goal, which according to Scripture was to leave their plane of existence and to enter ours. So my challenge then became to answer the question of how blending various species would satisfy that goal or provide the Watchers with a method of departure from high heaven and incarnation into man's habitation. Now, while I'm not going to take time here to explain every detail, there's actually a 5-hour CD set called As It Was in the Days of Noah, The Return of the Nephilim, that covers that and related material that you can get at the skywatchtvstore.com. But I eventually hypothesized that the Watchers had to blend species in that way in order to create a soulless or a spiritless body into which they could extend themselves. Now, the rationale is that every creature as it existed originally had its beginning in God, who ordered each creature to reproduce after its own kind. The phrase after its own kind verifies what kind of spirit or soul can enter into an intelligent being at conception. For instance, when the sperm of a dog meets ovum of a dog, the life of a dog is formed. At the first spark of life, the spirit of personality of a dog enters that embryo, and it grows to become a dog in spirit and form. The spirit of a man does not enter it, in the same way that a man is not born with the spirit of a horse or a cow. So this creature spirit integrity is part of the divine order that God made and would have kept the Watchers who wanted to incarnate within the human realm, not just possess creatures, but they wanted to become incarnate. It kept them from displacing the spirits of humans or animals and replacing them with their own. So how would they overcome that problem? Like scientists are doing today, it appears based on the ancient records that they blended existing DNA of several living creatures, and they made something that neither the spirit of man nor beast would enter at conception, for it was neither man nor beast. As the quarterly online travel guide Mysterious World and its featured giants in the earth noted, quote, the Nephilim were genetically manufactured beings created from the genetic material of various pre-existing animal species. The fallen angels did not personally interbreed with the daughters of men, but rather used their godlike intellect to delve into the secrets of Yahweh's creation and manipulate it for their own purposes. And the key to creating or recreating man, as we have rediscovered in the 20th century, is the human genome, DNA, end quote. Now, this manipulation of living tissue by the fallen angels led to a universal body made up of human, animal, and in some cases plant genetics known as Nephilim, an earth-born facsimile or fit extension into which they could incarnate. What's more, the long history of demonological phenomenon related to manipulation of biological matter suggests that versions of this curious activity have been ongoing ever since. My late friend and former college professor and BBC correspondent, Dr. Ida E. Thomas, in his highly recommended book, The Omega Conspiracy, chronicled the burgeoning of so-called alien abduction activity, and he tied it to end times prophecy concerning the return of these Nephilim. Documentation by abductees worldwide and the stories of DNA harvesting by aliens reminded him of the history of biological misuse by the Watchers, and it led Thomas to conclude that the identity of the Watchers and whoever the alien entities are were somehow connected. Dr. Thomas told me personally that the special desire by these unknown agents for human and animal molecular matter would explain why animals have been killed, mutilated, and stolen by aliens in UFO flap areas. Respected UFO researcher Dr. Jacques Vallée released similar questions. He said this: in order to materialize and take definite form, these entities seem to require a source of energy, a living thing, a human medium. Our sciences have not yet reached a point where they can offer us any kind of working hypothesis for this process, but we can speculate that these beings needed living energy, which they can reconstruct into physical form. Perhaps that's why dogs and animals tend to vanish in flap areas. Perhaps the living cells of those animals are somehow used by the ultra-terrestrials to create forms which we can see and sense with our limited perceptions, end quote. Like Thomas, Vallée connected this activity with the legendary acts of the Watchers, saying, are we dealing with a parallel universe, another dimension, where there are races, only semi-human, so that in order to maintain contact with us, they need crossbreeding with men and women of our planet? Is this the origin of the many tales and legends where genetics play a great role? The fairy tales involving human midwives and changelings, the sexual overtones of the flying saucer reports, the biblical stories of intermarriage between the Lord's angels and terrestrial women whose offspring were giants, end quote. Whether or not there is connection between the ancient power behind the Watcher narrative and the modern alien abduction activity documented by Vallée and others involving biological harvesting from humans and animals, records from antiquity include mysterious possibilities regarding the ability of the Watchers' deceased offspring to return to physical form at particular moments in time. The relationship between the Rephaim, the giant occupants of Canaan, of which Og, king of Bashan, whose bed was 18 feet long, belonged. The relationship between these, Rephaim, and the Nephilim becomes important here because the Rephaim were associated with the shades of the dead, including Nephilim in Sheol Hades. The meaning of the word Rephaim is especially germane, as it carries with it the idea to heal or to be healed, as in a resurrection from the place of the dead, Sheol Hades. In Hebrew, the seraphim were powerful angels whose name combined ser, S-E-R, meaning a higher being or angel, and Rapha, which means to heal. Now this connotes that angels of healing, or those that can be healed, might be playing some part here, some mysterious role. So the Rephaim may therefore be considered seraphim, which followed Lucifer in the fall. In the Rosh Hashanah text, the Rephaim are described as demigods who worship the Amorite god Baal, the ruler of the underworld. When Rephaim died, their spirits went into the underworld, where they joined Baal's acolyte assembly of lesser gods, kings, heroes, and rulers. These beings, according to ancient belief, had the power to return from the dead through reincarnation into bodily form as Nephilim. As mysterious world in Giants in the Earth also included, quote, the Rephaim giants were specifically noted by Moses as being the return of the antediluvian Nephilim, that the Rephaim were in fact the reincarnation of the demonic spirits of the Nephilim giants who had been destroyed in the flood, end quote. So a surprise to many Bible students would be to learn that even the prophet Isaiah may have considered this Amorite dogma to be factual, and that he tied the power of these beings to the kings of Babylon and Lucifer himself. For example, after prophesying against the Babylonian leader, Isaiah says in parallel to Rephaim theology, quote, hell, that is Sheol Hades, from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead, this is the word Rapha or Rephaim, for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It has raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. And they shall speak and say unto thee, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Isaiah 14, 9 through 10. Now, immediately following that statement, Isaiah looked beyond the Rephaim at who their Baal actually was, identifying him in verse 12, saying, How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, end quote. Other places in the Bible, such as Job 26:5, may agree with the idea of a Luciferian power that can, under some circumstances, return Rephaim from the underworld to physical bodies known as Nephilim. Dead things are formed from under the water, Job says. And the dead in that text are Rapha. And the phrase are formed is from hull, meaning to twist or to whirl, as in a double helix coil or genetic manufacturing. The startling implication of that in similar texts is that beneath the surface of the earth, agents of darkness wait the moment of their return. Before the end of this presentation, I'll consider several other ancient documents and scriptures that seem to forecast such a terrifying event for the end times. But first, let's look at what could be a biblical example of Nephilim resurrection. If indeed the activity of watchers was the use of biotechnology to produce exotic bodies of flesh for beings that have the ability under extraordinary circumstances to reincarnate after physical death, would the method of their returning from the grave likewise be an advanced form of science? I believe that could be the case, and the Bible may actually provide a record of that occurring. The story is doubly important to our topic here because it centers around Nimrod, the original character who later was mythologized as the god prophesied by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament and by the occult elite in the Great Seal of the United States as the ancient spirit that is going to return to earth to rule the Novus Ordo Seclorum, Apollo Osiris, who is reanimated on earth in the end times when the beast ascends from the bottomless pit and goes into perdition. That's Apollia, Apollo. Revelation 17:8 echoes the same thing. The story of Nimrod, or Gilgamesh, Apollo, Osiris by any other name, in the book of Genesis may illustrate how this could happen through genetic influence or a retrovirus of demonic design that integrates with the host's genome and rewrites the living specimen's DNA, thus making it a fit extension for infection by the entity. Genesis 10:8 says this about Nimrod, And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth, end quote. 3 sections in that unprecedented verse indicate something very peculiar had happened to Nimrod. First, note where the text says, he began to be. In Hebrew, this is halal, which means to become profaned, defiled, polluted, desecrated, ritually, sexually, or genetically. Second, that verse tells us exactly what Nimrod began to be. It says, quote, a mighty one, which is Gibborim, one of the offspring of Nephilim. As Annette Yoshiko-Reed says in her Cambridge University book, Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity, quote, the Nephilim of Genesis 6:4 are always grouped together with the Gibborim as the progeny of the Watchers and human women, end quote. And then the third part of this unusual text says the change to Nimrod started while he was on earth. Therefore, in modern language, this text can accurately be translated to say, quote, and Nimrod began to change genetically, becoming a Gibborim, the offspring of Watchers on earth, end quote. To understand how, as a mature living specimen, Nimrod could have began to be a Gibborim, it's helpful to imagine this in terms of biology as we know it. For instance, years ago, I began to be a diabetic. because of poor choices of food, diet, and exercise, my doctor told me that I triggered the genetic inherent and that it began changing me in powerful metabolic ways. This change was so powerful that for over a decade, until I discovered powerful supplements from Eden's Essentials that worked even better and restored my blood sugar to pre-diabetic conditions, that I had to take drugs to keep it from killing me. That's how powerful this disease is. And yet, just because I had the heritable, disease-related genotype that can lead to diabetes, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would develop the medical condition. It's entirely possible to be a carrier of a genetic mutation that increases the risk of developing a particular disease, but without ever actually becoming afflicted with the disorder in the course of a lifetime. But due to my earlier lifestyle, maybe even certain environmental conditions that I was unaware of, the gene mutation involved in the action of insulin turned on, for want of a better word, and I began to be a diabetic. Now, I've often wondered if the record of Nimrod that says he began to be a Gibborim indicated something similar about his genetics, his DNA, or his bloodline that turned on as a result of his decisions, triggering a change in him from one type of being to another. It's also a possibility, I suppose, that Nimrod became afflicted with a retrovirus that integrated with his genome and, in essence, rewrote his genetic makeup, fashioning him into a fit extension for an underworldly spirit. Now, when I asked Sharon Gilbert, whose formal education includes molecular biology and genetics, if she thought that was possible, she emailed me and said this, quote, "Absolutely, Tom. Retroviruses essentially inject single-stranded RNA strands into something, a body, a somatic body, cells during infection. These ssRNA strands access nucleotide pools in the host cell and form a double-stranded DNA copy. This dsDNA can then incorporate itself into the host chromosome using a viral enzyme called integrase. The new fake gene then orders the cell to make more mRNA copies of the original virus RNA. These then travel out of the cell and infect the next cell, and so on." End quote. So perhaps that type of genetic rewriting is implied in Genesis 10:8, which says, "And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one, a Gibborim, in the earth." In addition to such scientific deduction, another reason that I believe the story is suspicious is because of what Nimrod did immediately following Genesis chapter 10. As soon as he began to be a mighty one in the earth, one chapter later, he sets out to build a tower whose top would reach unto heaven, Genesis 11:4 says. This was the infamous Tower of Babel. And Nimrod was designing it so that the top of it would extend into Shamayim, or heaven, the abode of God. The Jewish Encyclopedia confirms several historical records that Nimrod, who it also establishes was identified by various ancient cultures alternatively as Osiris, Orion, Apollo, and Gilgamesh, built the Tower of Babel in an attempt to ascend into the presence of God. Jehovah himself came down and said of the tower's design, "Nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do," Genesis 11:6. In other words, according to the Lord, Nimrod would have accomplished what he imagined to do, to build a tower whose top would reach into the abode of God. That section of Scripture could be viewed as a secondary support for the concept of Nimrod having become revived watcher offspring is supported by Nimrod seeming to abruptly be aware of where and how tall to build a tower so that the top of it would penetrate the dwelling place of God. Were his eyes suddenly opened to realities that are outside man's normal mode of perception? As he became Gibborim, he would have taken on watchers' propensities, which as angels can see into the supernatural realm, including where heaven is located, and possibly where to enter it. Even the name Babylon implies this, meaning the gate of God or gateway to God. Now, that there could be sacred locations where those beings that can see into the supernatural realm could literally walk up onto a high place and enter heaven is not as far-fetched as it sounds. There's numerous records, including from the Bible, that appear to substantiate the idea that heaven can be attained on high towers or mountainous locations. Consider Moses meeting with God on Sinai, Jesus returning atop the Mount of Olives, the 200 watchers that descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and other examples, including Jacob's ladder. This could also explain why in the deep recesses of our psyche, people tend to believe that they can draw closer to God when going up on the mountains. Now, in addition to the possibility of suddenly seeing into the supernatural realm as a result of integration with fallen angels, if Nimrod was genetically modified according to the original Watcher formula, he would have inherited animal characteristics within his new material makeup. And at least some animals, like angels, can perceive domains the humans cannot. This includes obvious things like wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum, but possibly something even more substantial, like the spirit realm. For example, the famous story of Balaam's donkey, who could see the angel that Balaam could not. When Adam was created, he was made partly of clay from earth and partly of God's divine breath, which allowed him to see into and participate in extra-dimensional space. But once Adam chose to sin, the Lord decreed that mankind would no longer have access to the throne room of his hyper-dimensional mountain. For all intents and purposes, Eden was closed. However, humanity's desire for that mountaintop experience never diminished, so when the Watchers descended upon another holy mountain, Mount Hermon, those humans who witnessed it must have been awestruck. Regarding the event at Mount Hermon, for instance, we read in Genesis 6, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them." Genesis 6, 1-7. Many who are listening to this presentation are aware of this incursion of the Watchers that's recorded in the book of Genesis, and how the subsequent commingling of the angelic or extra-dimensional seed with human seed resulted in a race of beings called Nephilim. But you may not have read the account of this historic event contained within the extra-biblical source, the book of Enoch, where it says, "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. That's the book of Enoch, chapter 6, the R.H. Charles translation from 1917. This mountain, called Hermon, lies in what is known as the anti-Lebanon mountain range on the border between Syria and Lebanon. And this quote from the book of Enoch explains why the mountain is called by the name Hermon. They call the name Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it, it says. The root for Hermon is the Hebrew word hrm, which is a little bit complicated as it derives from two meanings. According to some experts, one component meaning appears to describe a transition between two stages. On the initial stage exists one continuum. On the second stage exists two continuums formed from the initial one. Now that's tantalizing, maybe confusing to be sure, since it provides a word picture of the transition of extra-dimensional beings who left their home in the Mount of Assembly to live on earth. They kept not their first estate, you might say. The second component to this word is that HRM is thought to be a cognate with an Arabic verb that means to be prohibited or become sacred, whereas the identical root verb haramtu is thought to be a cognate with a different Arabic verb that means to perforate or split. This second verb occurs only once in Leviticus 21:18, where it describes a disqualifying quality of a wannabe priest. So HRM holds within its rich contextual meaning a sense of profanity and a transition from worthy to unworthy. In this context, consider also another word that appears many times in the Old Testament, and that being the word harim, which means devoted to destruction. The basic structure of Hermon and harim is very close, so one wonders if the oath taken by the Watchers was that they would all continue in their sin, regardless of the outcome, that they would be devoted to destruction, which is, of course, precisely what happens to their idols and high places in the Old Testament. The choice to descend on Hermon implies prior knowledge of God's eventual plan to carve out Israel as a people for himself within their own land, a plan that may have been discussed and agreed upon during a divine council meeting. Now today, there are about 30 different temple sites on the slopes of Mount Hermon. Small g gods worshipped at those sites include Baal, also called Hadad, Pan, Zeus, and others. Since Semjaza and his other realm compatriots, the Watchers, came down at that spot, it may be that these 200 beings initiated a cottage industry, if you will, of cult worship that changed names throughout the succeeding generations and continued post-flood. What do I mean? In his book from Defender Publishing, The Great Inception, Derek Gilbert spends an entire chapter on Mount Hermon, and he explains this importance in sacred worship there. Quote, Mount Hermon was a holy site as far back as the Old Babylonian period, nearly 2 millennia before Christ, and maybe even earlier. In the Old Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic, which dates to the 18th century BC, roughly the time of Jacob, Hermon and Lebanon were called the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. The Ninevite version of the poem, written about 600 years later, describes the monster slain by Gilgamesh, Humbada or Huwawa, as the guardian of the abode of the gods. The Anunnaki were the 7 chief gods of the Sumerian pantheon. Anu, the sky god; Enlil, god of the air; Enki, god of the earth; Ninhursag, mother goddess of the mountains; Inanna, the Babylonian Ishtar, goddess of sex and war; Sin, the moon god; and Utu, the sun god. They are mentioned in texts found in what is today southeastern Iraq that date back to the 27th century BC. So it's possible that the more recent versions of the Gilgamesh story from Babylon and Nineveh remember more ancient traditions, and we'll discuss later why these ancient traditions may have been brought to Babylon from Syria far to the west. The name Hermon also appears to be based on a root word that means taboo, similar to the Hebrew word karim, or devoted to destruction. The word's often translated into English as under the ban. Simply put, Hermon was the abode of the Watchers, and their sinfulness led to a world at enmity with the Creator. However, despite that enmity, God remembered his promise to Adam and Eve to provide a Savior. So, when God Almighty decided to put an end to the sins engendered by the Watchers, their devotees, and their abominable offspring, both human hybrids and animal hybrids, and their human devotees, he preserved 8 human beings and a select group of animals to repopulate the earth. Noah and his family survived the deluge and replenished the earth. But the memory of the Watchers and the extra-dimensional worship on Mount Hermon and the remarkable men of renown, the Nephilim, survived the flood, eventually giving rise to the next false Mount of Assembly, Babel. Now, Sunday school teachers the world over love to teach us about the Tower of Babel because it allows them to use compelling imagery and explain how God sometimes intervenes in the plans of men, even if it means he must confuse our languages to do it. The actual historical account is not quite as neat and tidy, however. For starters, the word Babel is actually a play on words. We turn again to Derek Gilbert, who explains this in the great Inception quote. We often find words in the Bible that sound like the original, but make a statement. For example, Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, instead of Beelzebul, Baal the Prince. Or Ishbosheth, man of shameful thing, instead of Ishbaal, man of Baal. Likewise, the original Akkadian words, Bab-Elu, gate of the gods, is replaced in the Bible with Babel, which is based on the Hebrew word for confusion. Now, those Hebrew writers were certainly clever when it came to puns. Was this tower located in Babylon, as most Sunday school teachers would have you believe? Probably not. Derek Gilbert continues, quote, "So where should we look for the Tower of Babel? Remember, the oldest and largest ziggurat in Mesopotamia was at Eridu, the first city built in Mesopotamia. In recent years, scholars have learned that the name Babylon was interchangeable with other city names, including Eridu. Even though Eridu never dominated the political situation in Sumer after its first 2 kings, Alulim and Alagar, ruled immediately after the flood, Eridu was so important to Mesopotamian culture that more than 3,000 years later, Hammurabi, king of the old Babylonian Empire in the 18th century BC, was crowned not in Babylon, but in Eridu, even though Eridu had ceased to be a city about 300 years earlier. Even as late as the time of Nebuchadnezzar, 1,100 years after Hammurabi, the kings of Babylon still sometimes called themselves Lugal-Nunki, or king of Eridu. Why? What was the deal with Eridu? Yes, it was the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, which, I will repeat, was possibly built by Cain or his son, and perhaps named for Cain's grandson, Irad. So think about that for a moment. Eridu, its name interchangeable with Babylon, may have been established by the first murderer on earth. In a sense then, Cain, not Nimrod, was the founder of original Babylon. end quote. Chilling thought, isn't it, that Gilbert came up with there? That the tower where men sought to open a gateway to the gods, that artificial mountain built by Nimrod, was probably built within a city descended from the hands of the world's first killer. The plain of Shinar, being a plain, had no mountains. So the city's planning and zoning department had to find another way to ascend into the heavenlies and bring down the small g gods that once brought enlightenment to the world from Hermon, since the heights were where these portals existed. Then to access these doorways, one has to build a stairway to heaven. Hence, we arrive at the very first big public works project where everyone pitched in to add his or her own brick to the rising walls of religious heresy. But there's a secondary, as above, so below sort of aspect to this man-made mountain of Babel, and that's its roots. In the Bible, we often see that mountains have roots that reach into the earth and possibly into spiritual extra-dimensional space beyond. For example, in Jonah chapter 2, the writer describes a harrowing journey into the bowels of the earth, saying, I descended to the roots of the mountains. The earth with its bars was around me forever, but you have brought up my life from the pit, O my God. Jonah 2:6. In the case of the artificial mountain of Babel at Eridu, construction may have occurred over the waters of the 𝑒-𝑚𝑎𝑙, where stood the Temple of Enki. Derek Gilbert also explains this, quote, archaeologists have uncovered 18 levels of the temple to Enki. The oldest levels of the 𝑒-𝑚𝑎𝑙, a small structure less than 10 feet square, date to the founding of the city around 5400 BC. Fish bones were scattered around the building, which means Enki seems to have been a fan of Euphrates River carp. Now, think about that for a moment. That first small shrine to Enki may have been built by Cain or one of his immediate descendants. And consider that the spot remained sacred to Enki long after the city was finally deserted, which was around the year 2000 BC. And the temple site wasn't abandoned until the 5th century BC, nearly 5,000 years after the first crude shrine was built to accept offerings of fish to the god of the subterranean waters, the Abzu. Now, at this point, I should tell you that Abzu is the word from which we get our modern English word abyss. So Nimrod, who may have claimed to be part god, chose to construct his mountain of brick and stone upon the watery temple of Enki, lord of the abyss. Not only was Nimrod attempting to assault the heights, but perhaps he hoped Enki and his underworld minions would help him in that attempt. There is so much more to discuss with regard to Babel's towering artificial mountain, but it's beyond the scope of this presentation. So let's move to another world mountain that is an imitation of the original divine mount of God. This one is another Sunday school favorite called Carmel. Elijah's confrontation with the priests of Baal on the mountain of Carmel or Carmel is the kind of story that could easily be made into a blockbuster movie. It's got all the elements: a hero, Elijah, villains, Jezebel, Ahab, and those nasty priests, and a visually breathtaking locale. King Ahab ruled the northern tribes in Israel during the 9th century BC as part of the Omri dynasty. Not the brightest bulb in the box. He married Jezebel, daughter of the Ethbel, king of the Sidonians. It's thought that Jezebel's name is actually an intentional shortening of the Phoenician name of Beelzebul, meaning Baal has exalted. But that's speculation. Regardless of the exact meaning of her name, Jezebel was a piece of work. Her name also arises in the letter to the church at Thyatira in the book of Revelation. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, it says, because thou sufferest, that woman Jezebel, which called herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols, Revelation 2:20. Now, is the woman Christ mentions here the Old Testament queen? Probably not, but rather a false teacher whose cult proliferated in Thyatira and probably provided the seed for the great whore of Babylon, false religion and idol worship. In fact, the residents of Thyatira made their living from the production of purple dye. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and sinfulness of her fornication, it says in Revelation 17:4. While Jezebel and Ahab play the villains in the story, the scene is actually a high mountaintop. Mount Carmel is located near the modern city of Haifa, not far from Megiddo. The high place located on this mountain served as a cult center for the god Melkart. The name Carmel means garden, but its name is tantalizingly similar to 𝑘_r_m or 𝑘_r_im, mentioned earlier with respect to Hermon and devoted to destruction. So one wonders if this is a nudge, nudge, wink, wink moment from the Holy Spirit, that the mountain's name indicates a garden or vineyard. This is evocative of the original Mount of Assembly and its well-watered Garden of Eden. Considering that the god worshipped by Ahab and Jezebel lived in a well-watered garden akin to Eden, the 3-year-long drought indicated upon Israel by Yahweh might have seemed even harder to explain. Because after this 3-year period, when crop fields and bellies alike grew more and more empty, according to the bellies of the cattle, so protein supplies were at an all-time low at the local big box store in Elijah's day, Elijah shows up to talk with King Ahab. Needless to say, Ahab placed the blame for the drought and his declining popularity in the polls squarely on the shoulders of the prophet of the Lord. But Elijah wasn't about to put up with that. In fact, he put the blame on the king and queen and challenged Ahab and the god that he worshipped to a duel. Now, therefore, send and gather, it says, to me all Israel upon Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the groves 400, which eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent unto all the children of Israel, and gathered the prophets together unto Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18:19 through 20. This smackdown consisted of 850 priests of Baal against one solitary prophet of the Lord. Most would consider that an uneven matchup, right? And they'd be right. Those pitiful priests of Baal never saw it coming, however. Mount Carmel was considered holy for at least 600 years before Elijah's day. The name Carmel means vineyard of God, or, considering the influence of Amorite Canaanite religion, especially under Ahab and Jezebel, vineyard of El, E-L. Pharaoh Thutmose III, on his way to the Battle of Megiddo, mentioned earlier, probably meant Mount Carmel in an inscription that mentioned Rosh Hadish, or Holy Headland. Later in the 4th century BC, a Greek geographer called Mount Carmel the Mountain of Zeus, specifically an incarnation of Zeus called Zeus Heliopolis. That was a reference to Heliopolis in Phoenicia, located at the north of Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. We know that city today by a different name, Baalbek. Now, if you've researched megalithic structures at all, you've heard the name Baalbek. And we won't go into a discussion of the trilithon, the 3 massive stones from the retaining wall of the Temple of Jupiter. Let's just say that at 880 tons each, they're impressive. The important point, though, is that Jupiter's temple at Baalbek was built on top of an older temple to Hadad, Baal. Remember, Jupiter equals Zeus equals Baal. The high priests of Baal did their best to summon this god, but the entity never answered. presumably because the real power in heaven had told the fallen angel watcher that he was not permitted to do so. Despite their God's continued silence, the energetic acolytes shouted, sang, prayed, wept, danced, even cut themselves. The types of self-maiming employed by these priests meant that they would actually flay themselves in huge stripes along their chests, carving deep grooves. Well, needless to say, the small g god of Mount Carmel didn't care, didn't answer. So, what does Elijah do? After 3 years of no rain, he tells the men to bring large jars of water to douse the altar and the wood. The audience were probably thinking, man, oh man, what a waste. And this meant that someone had to climb down the mountain to the Kishon River at the foot of Carmel, fill up the jars, and then trudge back up the hillside with the heavy load. Not fun, but they did it. And before long, the altar and wood were soaked. Only then did Elijah pray. He did not wail. He did not cry out. He did not weep. He did not cut himself. He prayed softly, asking the Lord to answer by supernatural fire. Remember, the gods of these mountaintops were usually considered as storm gods. So think Zeus or Odin, Hadad, Baal, Horus, Indra, Set, to name a few. So answering by fire should have been an easy task for old 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART. But as mentioned earlier, he most likely had been told to keep his silence. In fact, Elijah even taunts the priests during their frenzy, and he suggests that their God is sleeping. And one version of the Bible, out sitting on a toilet. And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them, and he said, "Cry aloud, for he is a God. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth and must be awakened." 1 Kings 18:27. Now, why would Elijah suggest that 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART was snoozing? Because storm gods were also the rising and dying gods who spent half of the year beneath the earth. It's assumed then that this showdown either occurred during the half of the year when 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART was in occultation, dead or sleeping, or else he was simply too busy to be bothered. But the ultimate power in heaven, no matter what the powers and principalities like to believe, is God Almighty. And he had told 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART to stand down. Consequently, the God of the high place on Carmel was offline that day. Now, the story of Mount Carmel has a great superhero ending. Elijah's triumph, or rather Yahweh is triumphant. The fire comes down and consumes the sacrifice. Rain returns to Israel, and the priests of Baal are rounded up and killed by the very river where they had drawn out that water. Even Jezebel gets hers in the end. She's tossed off the top of a high building, and the dogs are the only ones interested enough to tend to her body. So, who is 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART? This one will probably come as a surprise, and I'll give credit to Derek Gilbert for his scholarship and tenacity to uncover this nugget. He writes, quote, "As we mentioned, 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART was one of the dying and rising gods. He would die in the fall and rise again every spring, following the annual growth cycle of agriculture. Religious rites accompanied this god's death and resurrection every year. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Tyre in the 5th century BC and reported that he had seen 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART's tomb inside his magnificent temple. That would be consistent with Elijah's jibe that their God was asleep and has to be awakened. On the other hand, and here's the kicker, the presence of a tomb might indicate that the cult of 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART was based on a deified person instead of a spirit. You see, 𝑚𝑒𝑙𝑘ART was the Phoenician name of Hercules, better known as Heracles. So think about that for a moment. In all probability, the 450 priests who met their doom on Mount Carmel that fateful day served Hercules. I bet you won't see that in a Disney movie. Another legendary mount was Olympus. The Greek pantheon lived high up in the sky, so we were told to think. on a mythical mountain called Olympus. But was this an imaginary mountain or a very real historical one? Zeus and his fellow Olympians became rulers of the earth after a massive worldwide smackdown called the Titanomachy. According to legends, and there have been several monarchies amongst the small g gods since Genesis 6, and perhaps even at least one prior to that, if indeed theories held by some, which we don't have time or space here to pursue, regard a previous creation that preceded the one in Genesis. The first generation of divine rulers are often called the primordial gods: Chaos, Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, Erebus, and Nyx. These gave rise to the Titans, the 12 children of Chaos and Gaia, sometimes listed as Uranus or Kronos and Gaia, sky and earth. These 12 were giants, and they lived on Mount Orthrus. Kronos, or Cronus, led these 12 Titans, planning their stratagems from their bunker atop Mount Others. Just as the descendants of Noah following the flood may have looked back to the antediluvian realm as a golden age of learning and accomplishment, except for being eaten by those giants, the Greeks thought of the reign of Kronos and the Titans as a golden age as well. But all so-called good things have to come to an end, and thus it was with Kronos and his cronies. Kronos was a real piece of work, aided and abetted by his bloodthirsty mom, Gaia. Dad, Kronos, didn't really like his kids, so he hid a couple of his giant children in Tartarus. Mom didn't like that, so she persuaded good son Kronos to use a sickle to castrate Dad. As a side note, this is why time, or Kronos, is always pictured as death carrying a sickle. And the fourth horseman may, in some respects, represent Kronos Saturn, or Saturnia in his Roman equivalent, returning, but that's another whole subject for a different time. Once the dark deed was done, Kronos became the new king of the world, and he married his sister Rhea and begat Zeus and the Olympians. Well, guess what? The apple didn't fall very far from the sickle-wielding tree, because Zeus decided to take out Dad and his buddies, thus the Titanomachy. The Olympians won, and Zeus and his victorious brethren set up camp on the heights of Olympus. These details include Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hermes, Hestia, and last but not least, the dying and rising god Apollo, or Apollyon. It's quite possible that the various Olympians have been worshipped by people across the globe under different names, reaching all the way back to the descent at Hermon. And now, if Apollo is actually constrained within the abyss now, then the 𝑒-𝑚𝑒 mentioned earlier that lies beneath the artificial mountain of Babel may actually be where the extra-dimensional Olympus is located. And Apollo and his brethren want one more crack at conquering the world. Let me add one last commentary for you to consider. Many know that I have written and produced numerous books and documentaries on transhumanism and how I see certain advancing fields of science as connected to a return of the days of Noah, possibly even connected to the return of Nephilim. As biotechnology and synthetic biology advance to the degree that we can now realistically anticipate reviving long-dead species, I've been able to convince a few scholarly friends that the sin of the Watchers that gave rise to legendary giants and even the man of sin himself could unfold via the genetic sciences and even result in the return of a deceased Apollo, Osiris, Nimrod, who arrives via biotech resurrection. Even my late friend Chuck Missler, though not with the same details, raised the appropriate question in an online article about the Antichrist. He asked this, quote, "Could it be that this final world dictator will be, in some sense, a return of Nimrod?" End quote. In my opinion, that's more than a possibility. And I remember with curiosity how in 1998, Zahi Hawass, the Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, claimed to have found the burial tomb of the god Osiris, Apollo Nimrod, at the Giza Plateau. In the article Sandpit of Royalty from the newspaper Ekstrabladet, which is Copenhagen, January 31, 1999, Hawass said, quote, "I have found a shaft going 29 meters vertically down into the ground, exactly halfway between the Chephren pyramid and the Sphinx. At the bottom, which was filled with water, we have found a burial chamber with 4 pillars. In the middle is a large granite sarcophagus, which I expect to be the grave of Osiris, the god. I have been digging in Egypt's sand for more than 30 years, and up to date, this is the most exciting discovery I have made. We found the shaft in November and began pumping up the water recently, so several years will pass before we have finished investigating the find," end quote. Now, as far as I know, that discovery did not ultimately provide the physical remains of the deity. Of course, that's as far as I know. But what it did illustrate is that at least some very powerful Egyptologists believe that Osiris was a historical figure, and that his body was stored somewhere at or near the Great Pyramid. Now, Manly P. Hall, the famous Freemason, who knew the Masonic legend of Harim-Abif was a thinly veiled prophecy of the resurrection of Osiris, may have understood what Zahi Hawass was looking for and why. Consider that he wrote in the Secret Teachings of All Ages, quote, "The dying God shall rise again. The secret room in the house of the hidden places shall be rediscovered. The pyramid again shall stand as the ideal emblem of solidarity, inspiration, aspiration, resurrection, and regeneration," end quote. Over the years, my other friend, biblical scholar Gary Stearman, has written extensively about Nimrod, Apollo, Osiris, Gilgamesh, and the connection that that historical figure has with Babylonian mystery religion, Watchers, Nephilim, including their resurrection, the spirit of the end times Antichrist, and a revival of paganism. It appears that he too believes the coming of Antichrist represents a return of Nimrod. But who is this Assyrian? Gary asked in his January 2001 Prophecy in the News magazine. Quote, "He is none other than the spiritual inheritor of the first great post-flood religious apostasy. He is the keeper of the great heritage that began at the Assyrian capital, Nineveh. Its founder was Nimrod. He is the Antichrist, the future despot who comes in the name of the ancient mystery religion," end quote. Now, a year earlier, in 2000, Stearman had written in Prophecy in the News concerning Nimrod this, quote, "He was a rebel who allowed himself to be worshipped as a god. After the flood, his rebellion became the foundation of mankind's greatest religious apostasy, down through the generations. This system of false worship became known simply as the Babylonian mystery religion. Its basis is quite clear. It attempts to channel the power of the ancient gods through the figure of one powerful man. Nimrod became that god," end quote. Alexander Hislop, in his classic text, The Two Babylons, substantiated Stearman's thesis that the Babylonian mystery religion was based on the worship of Nimrod. Quote, "It was to glorify Nimrod that the whole Chaldean system of iniquity was formed," he wrote. But Stearman sees that the mystery religion continued secretly throughout the ages, shrouded in hiding by adepts of the occult, in anticipation of a final moment when the ancient spirit will be awakened. He wrote, quote, "Corrupt priesthoods have flourished. carrying with them the shadow of Nimrod and his ancient mysteries. Their inner secrets have been known by various names, including alchemy, magic, sorcery, conjuring, soothsaying, and so forth, waiting for the prophesied day when it would rise once again. This movement will result in the reign of the Antichrist, end quote. In addition to the supernatural aspects that biotechnology could provide this Luciferian technology to resurrect the Nimrod, Apollo, Osiris character in the person of the last days man of sin, the ramifications of using the same science to revive extinct animals or Nephilim, or to create newly engineered versions of demigods and mythological animals, may also play a key role in the kingdom of Antichrist. This is because as interbreeding begins between transgenic animals, genetically modified humans, and species as God made them, such as is happening right now, the altered DNA will quickly migrate into the natural environment, and when that happens, as is occurring among genetically modified plants and animals right now, alien and/or animal characteristics will be introduced to the human gene pool and spread through intermarriage, altering the human genetic code and eventually eliminating humanity as we know it. That is what happened before the Great Flood, according to many theologians, and perhaps that's been the whole idea for the end times as well, to create a generation of genetically altered Nimrods to serve as fit extensions for the resurrection of underworld Nephilim hordes in preparation of Armageddon. Does a curious verse in the book of Daniel hint at that? Speaking of the last days of human government, Daniel wrote, quote, "They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay," end quote, Daniel 2:43. Now, while Daniel does not explain who they that mingle themselves with the seed of men are, the personal pronoun they caused Chuck Missler and Mark Eastman in their book Alien Encounters to ask this question, quote, "Just what or who are mingling with the seed of men? Who are these non-seed?" It staggers the mind to contemplate the potential significance of Daniel's passage and its implication for the future global governance, end quote. Daniel's verse troubled Missler and Eastman because it seemed to indicate that the same phenomenon that occurred in Genesis chapter 6, where non-human species or non-seed mingled with human seed and produced Nephilim, would happen again in the end times. When this verse from Daniel is coupled with Genesis 3:15, which says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed," Zerah, meaning offspring, descendants or children, and her seed, an incredible tenet emerges: that Satan has seed, and that it is at enmity with Christ. To mingle non-human seed with Homo sapiens through altering human DNA while simultaneously returning Nephilim to earth has been the inspiration of the spirit of Antichrist ever since God halted the practice during the Great Flood. According to Louise Pauwels and Jacques Berglet in The Dawn of Magic, this was certainly the goal of the Antichrist Adolf Hitler. Here's what they wrote, quote, "Hitler's aim was neither the founding of a race of supermen nor the conquest of the world. These were only means towards the realization of the great work that he dreamed of. His real aim was to perform an act of creation, a divine operation, the goal of a biological mutation which would result in an unprecedented exaltation of the human race and the apparition of a new race of heroes and demigods and godmen," end quote. Now, one cannot read the conclusion by Pauwels and Bergier regarding Hitler's Antichrist ambition without seeing how it corresponds perfectly with the 𝑐𝑜𝑚𝑒 prophecy on the Great Seal of the United States of America pertaining to the coming of Apollo, who receives, quote, the life of gods and sees heroes with gods commingling, end quote. This calls to mind that from the Middle Ages forward, church leaders have believed that the Antichrist would ultimately represent the return of the Nephilim, the reunion of demons with humans. St. Augustine himself wrote of that demoniality in The City of God. And the famous Father Sinistreri di Amino also perceived the coming of Antichrist as representing the biological hybridization of demons with humans. He wrote this, quote, "To theologians and philosophers, it is a fact that from the copulation of humans with the demon, Antichrist must be born," end quote. The English theologian George Hawkins Pember agreed with that premise, and in his 1876 masterpiece, Earth's Earliest Ages, he analyzed the prophecy of Christ that says the end times would be a repeat of the days of Noah. Pember outlined the 7 great causes of the antediluvian destruction, and he documented their developmental beginnings in his lifetime. But the 7th and most fearful sign, Pember wrote, would be the return of the Nephilim, the appearance on earth of beings from the principality of the air and their unlawful intercourse with the human race, end quote. Consequently, if the Antichrist is the reincarnation of the demon Apollo, as prophesied by the Apostle Paul, not only will he be the exact opposite of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, but the forerunner of the return of the Nephilim. The prophet Isaiah in chapters 13 and 14 likewise spoke of the return of these beings and tied the advent to the destruction of the city of Babylon in the final age. From the Septuagint we read, quote, "The vision which Isaiah, son of Amos, saw against Babylon, lift up a standard on the mountain of the plain, exalt the voice to them, beckon with the hand, open the gates, ye ruler. I give command and I bring them. Giants are coming to fulfill my wrath. For behold, the day of the Lord is coming, which cannot be escaped, a day of wrath and anger to make the world desolate. And Babylon shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, and monsters shall rest there, and devils shall dance there, and satyrs shall dwell there." Isaiah 13. One can only speculate if something more than is casually perceived is meant by Isaiah when he says, "Open the gates, ye ruler." But whoever this ruler is, he opens gates in Iraq, Babylon, through which end times giants, Gibborim, return to the surface of the earth as agents of God's wrath in the end time. Noting that Isaiah ties the destruction of Iraq, Babylon with the reappearance of Gibborim in this way, we recall how thousands of U.S. troops on invading Iraq during the Bush administration admittedly filled U.S. containers with archaeological materials, including what some have speculated to be cuneiform tablets, pointing to the location of pure-blooded Nephilim buried in underground caves. This is exactly where Enoch said the antediluvian Nephilim are, and it raises fascinating questions. Would agencies like DARPA have interest in studying or cloning the extinct beings if they were or had been found? Could man, in his arrogance, revive ancient DNA, revitalizing or blending it with other living organisms in a way similar to what the Watchers did in making the first Nephilim? Is this how the Rephaim, the dead Nephilim, who are viewed as squirming beneath the surface of the earth, arise to challenge the armies of God during Armageddon? Is the factual reappearance on earth of legendary beings verified by Isaiah, who foresaw creatures such as satyrs, transgenic half-men, half-goats, accompanying the return of giants in the end times? Or why other apocryphal books like 2 Ezra 5:8 prophesy the birth of monsters for the same period of time? Now, some may be shocked to learn that in addition to the citations I have made, the Bible actually describes an end-time confrontation between the mythological gods and Christ. The Lord will be terrible unto them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth, says Zephaniah 2:11. The Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saith, Behold, I will punish the gods, Jeremiah 46:25. Human followers of the pagan deities are also going to join in this conflict, calling upon their idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, Revelation 19:20 says, to convene their powers against the Christian God, uniting with, quote, unclean spirits like frogs, the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth to gather them to the battle of that great day, to a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon, or Megiddo, end quote, Revelation 16:13 through 14 and 16. Given that the prophets foretold a day when mythical characters and gods are going to return to earth to conduct war against the God of the Bible, it's more than a little disturbing that man has, for the first time since before the Great Flood, intentionally set course now to repeat what ancient records say the Watchers did, the genetic manipulation and alteration of God's creation, the accelerated pace by scientific exploration against God's divine order, and the subsequent revival of Watcher technology, leading to transhuman or revived forms of Nephilim, has without doubt pushed the end times clock closer to midnight than most people can even start to comprehend.